The meeting will come to order. I note that a quorum is present and that each member has before them copies of the material on our agenda today at their place at the rostrum. We have before us for consideration the Agricultural Reconciliation Act of 2012, which are recommendations to the Budget Committee with respect to the Reconciliation Bill for fiscal year 2013. I'd like to take this opportunity to remind members that only amendments germane to the subject matter before us today shall be in order. No motion or proposition on a subject different than that under consideration shall be submitted before under the color of amendment. Good morning, and thank you all for joining us to consider our budget reconciliation instructions. It's no secret that we're facing a severe debt crisis right now. We have almost $16 trillion in debt piled up, and if we don't act quickly, we'll be passing a crushing burden on to our children and grandchildren. This committee was asked to do our part by finding $7.7 billion in savings in the first year, $19.7 billion in savings in 5 years, and $33.2 billion in savings over 10 years. Reducing government spending is never an easy task. We face difficult choices, but it is our responsibility to find ways to cut our costs so we can once again live within our means. The recommendations we're considering today achieve more than $33 billion in savings from the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program by making credible reforms that reduce waste, abuse, and close program loopholes. SNAP, formerly known as food stamps, comprises almost 80% of agricultural spending. And over the past 10 years, the cost of SNAP has nearly tripled, increased by 270%. The cuts we're proposing today cut only 4% over the next 10 years. And I'd like to be clear from the start that none of these recommendations will prevent families that qualify for assistance under SNAP law from receiving those benefits. We're working to better target the program and improve its integrity so that families most in need continue to receive nutrition assistance. We'll do that in a number of ways. First, SNAP's resources have been stretched because the Obama administration has encouraged states to take liberties in how the program is administered. Some states are making nominal low-income home energy assistance program payments, LIHEAP, to households so that they get an income deduction to help them receive a higher amount in SNAP benefits. In practice, that means that states that can game the system by sending out a $1 check can trigger an increase of up to $130 in SNAP benefits. Closing this loophole saves $14.3 billion over 10 years and ensures that both LIHEAP and SNAP are targeted to the families who truly need assistance. Similarly, many states have implemented categorical eligibility for SNAP, which means that any household who benefits from a low-income assistance program is automatically eligible for SNAP benefits. Some of these benefits can be as simple as providing a household with a pamphlet or access to a 1-800 number hotline. When states implement categorical eligibility, those households do not need to meet SNAP, asset, or gross income tests. This provision changes nothing for households that qualify for the program under the rules of SNAP law. And those households will continue to receive the benefit level for which they qualify. Families that receive cash assistance can still take advantage of the categorical eligibility for SNAP. But by ensuring that only cash assistance triggers SNAP eligibility and not other benefits like brochures, we can save $11.7 billion over 10 years. We're also trusting states to do their job in administering SNAP. Currently, USDA awards $48 million per year to states for improving program efficiency. We all support good government efforts, but taxpayers cannot afford to pay bonuses to states that are essentially just doing their job. My colleague, Dr. Dargelet, has introduced legislation that ends state performance bonuses, and our recommendations include this policy change that will save the taxpayers $480 million over 10 years. States operate employment and training programs as a part of SNAP. Federal formula grants cover the cost of these initiatives. However, USDA provides a 50-50 cost share benefit when states spend more than their federal grant on these E&T programs. By maintaining the federal grant but cutting the 50-50 cost share, we could save $3.1 billion over 10 years while ensuring that SNAP participants still have access to training resources. States also provide nutrition education for SNAP participants. This is funded at $375 million and indexed for inflation. By eliminating the inflation indexing, we can save $546 million over 10 years, while still ensuring that SNAP participants encouraging them to live a healthy lifestyle. Lastly, we could save $5.9 billion, ending an artificial increase in benefits under the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. Targeting this policy for savings is by no means new. My colleagues in the minority voted twice to end these benefits earlier than planned to find $14.5 billion in offsets for other programs in the last Congress. Every one of these proposals represents common sense and good government in a time of fiscal restraint. We're closing loopholes, we're reducing waste and abuse, increasing the integrity of the program by ensuring that SNAP serves only those households who qualify for the program. There's no denying that SNAP provides important support for many Americans. That's why it's important that we ensure the integrity of the program. By voting for this package, we're not only doing our part to reduce the debt, but also continuing to provide nutrition assistance for American families most in need. And with that, I yield to the ranking member for any comments he might have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And it's often said that the Ag Committee is the least partisan of all committees, and we have bipartisan tradition. We've been being reasonable and having a commitment to working together in the best interests of our constituents, and we work hard at that. And I still think that's true, but today I think is somewhat of an exception. In fact, I would contend that this entire process is mostly a waste of time because it doesn't mean anything. The Senate's not agreed to any kind of reconciliation, and as you've said, Mr. Chairman, the Senate most certainly won't touch this bill. So this proposal before us is not serious. You can't have a serious conversation about getting the budget under control when you take large items like defense off the table, which is really why we're here. Taking a meat axe to nutrition programs that feed millions of working families in this country in an effort to avoid defense cuts is not a serious way to achieve deficit reduction. And, it's no wonder nobody likes Congress. I'd also like to say that, this budget situation, process that we have is completely broken. It has become a partisan deal on both sides. And, the press covers this like this is the end of the world or something. And the truth of the matter is the Budget Committee doesn't have any power to do anything. And in the end, we have to make the decisions here in the committee. And so now we're using reconciliation because that's the only way the Budget Committee can actually make anything happen. So somehow or another, we either got to reform this budget process or we got to abolish the Budget Committee completely, which may be the best alternative. But anyway, I'll go back to script here. We have a farm bill to write, Mr. Chairman, and we've heard from folks representing all titles of the farm bill, from farm programs to conservation to nutrition. And one thing is clear, they want us to get our work done. They want us to get it done this year. And I stand ready, Mr. Chairman, to work with you and your members and our members in a bipartisan and serious manner to set the priorities for farm and food programs for the next 5 years. It won't be easy. We know that. There are real and legitimate budget pressures. But I hope that we're all ready to make the difficult decisions we all know are necessary. I understand why you need to engage in this political exercise. So I just caution that if we continue down the path before us today, it'll make it more difficult. And so I think the best thing is just kind of get by this. This isn't going to mean anything in the end anyway. And when we get to the Farm Bill process, we look forward to working with you to address these issues and get this Farm Bill done. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and hopefully we can have a short and abrupt conclusion to this.
The chair thanks the ranking member for his always insightful comments. Without objection, the Agriculture Reconciliation Act of 2012 is laid before the committee, and the first reading of the text will be waived. It will be open for amendment at any point. I would now like to recognize council for a brief explanation.
Yeah.
Council?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Section 101 is the short title of the bill. Section 102 amends the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009 by terminating on July 1st, 2012, the increased Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program benefits provided under the Act. Section 103 amends the Food and Nutrition Act of 2008, hereinafter the Act, to restrict categorical eligibility for the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program to only those households receiving cash assistance through other low-income assistance programs. Section 104 amends the Act by striking a provision that requires a state agency using a standard utility allowance to provide the allowance to each household that receives any payment under the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Act of 1981. Section 105 amends the Act by striking a provision that provides a cost share to states for certain expenses incurred in operating an employment and training program. Section 106 amends the Act by eliminating the performance bonuses provided to states for effectively administering the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. Section 107 amends the Act by reducing the allocation to state agencies to carry out employment and training programs for fiscal year 2013 to $79 million. Section 108 amends the Act by eliminating indexing on the Nutrition, Education, and Obesity Prevention Grant Program. Section 109 amends the Act by extending the authorization for appropriations to carry out the Act through fiscal year 2013, and Section 110 provides the effective dates of the provisions.
Thank you, council. Are there any amendments to the measure? Any members seek recognition? The gentleman from Georgia seeks recognition to strike the last word.
Yes, sir. I move to strike the last word, Mr.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to do two quick things. First of all, I want to set the record straight of how we got into this situation where we are now, because we have to really be truthful with the American people, because this is really strikes at the heart of fairness and justice and decency, which is the heart and soul of the American spirit. Now, what we did was we passed a law last year called the Budget Control Act of 2011. It established discretionary spending caps, and it created what we affectionately refer to as the super committee. It was then asked to find an additional $1.2 trillion to $1.5 trillion in savings. And if the super committee failed to reach that goal, which they did, then the Budget Control Act contained an automatic spending cut trigger called sequestration. These cuts were evenly divided between defense and security spending and domestic discretionary spending. But here is the important rub. Most importantly, they protected vital Social Security net programs such as Social Security, Medicare, SNAP, which is the food aid for American citizens. Then, all of a sudden, this situation changed. This was the law. This is what we voted upon. This is what we signed. And it's a wonder, as the ranking member said, why the American people hold this Congress in such disdain. Now, here we are, reshuffling the deck as if we never passed this law. And because we had this disagreement between defense and other areas, now we want to shift it and say we want all of these cuts now to fall disproportionately on the poor. Now, this is the situation we find ourselves in when we fail to realize that, yes, we got to cut the budget. Yes, we got to balance it, but not on the backs of the poor, while at the same time we refuse to bring in additional revenue and don't ask the wealthy to pay their fair share. So here we are faced with now. I'm a champion of defense. Defense is important to my state of Georgia. Nobody in here is strong on national security than I am. But this is the position we find ourselves in when we're having to rob Peter to pay Paul. And we're not asking the wealthier people to come in and help us. You can't pay down the debt and pay your bills without going out and getting additional revenue. So, Mr. Chairman, it's disappointing, although a bit unsurprising, that the Ryan budget, which comes into play here, and it's placed its reconciliation targets where it did on the SNAP program. It is unconscionable to me how anyone can look needy Americans straight in the face and say it is more important to me to protect spending on programs that destroy life rather than spend money on programs that save lives, that build American lives. I just don't understand it. Certainly defense and security spending is very important. We've got to have a safe and secure nation. But if anyone makes the argument that the defense budget of this nation, which is greater than the next 10 nations combined, is not bloated, full of largesse, and in need of trimming, then that person is either not paying attention or not telling the truth. Mr. Chairman, we've just spent 10 years and almost $1.5 trillion off the budget, borrowed from China, fighting two wars simultaneously. And now when someone suggested it's time to focus our attention here at home to support programs and policies that build our American people up, that feed American people, suddenly we're out of money. And out of money that is, unless, of course, you happen to make something that blows people up, because then we have money to spare. I don't understand it. And in that respect, I'm almost glad that we're having this markup today, because it will really elucidate for the American people the priorities, and especially with some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, my Republican friends. So I really hope the country is watching what's going on in this Agriculture Committee today, to see members say that they'd rather take food from hungry children, hungry families here at home, than to spend less money killing people halfway around the world. That they'd rather risk having poorly nourished children and seniors here in America than to cut back in funding that we shell out to corrupt and incompetent governments like in Afghanistan. That it's better to cut off funding that helps people heat their homes, keep their lights on, rather than to have wealthy Americans pay their fair share. I just don't get it. Make no mistake, we cannot continue to try to balance our budget on the backs of poor people and cut $33 million in cuts outlined in this package from SNAP and from programs that will help utilities for the poor and are real dangerous and will have a severe detrimental impact on this entire country. And let me tell you something, Mr. Chairman, these programs are not the sole province of urban or minority congressional districts. Let me make that clear. These cuts will hurt everybody, no matter what color you are, no matter where you live. These cuts will hurt the young and the old. 47% of SNAP recipients are children. Think about it. 8% are elderly. The black and the white. 35% of SNAP recipients are white. 21% are black. Let's pull the covers off of this and make sure the Americans see what we're talking about here. These are America's people. All of us. That these cuts are hurting. They're not just people that live in public housing or in cities. These are hurting people out in the countries. They're hurting people out in the back roads. They're hurting people on the farms. Almost 2 million people in Georgia alone receive assistance from the SNAP program. And you spread out through all of Georgia, it's 159 counties. And it will be devastating. Every single one of these people in my district, in my state, in your districts, in your states, will suffer under this program, under this proposal. How on earth can we hope to sustain an economic recovery when people can't even eat properly? Farmers and food producers, many of whom could go out of business. Yes, farmers can go out of business because they rely on this program. But more importantly, Mr. Chairman, how on earth can we say to those 2 million Georgians and 46 million people nationwide that their health and well-being is less important than bombs and bullets? I just don't understand it. And now, Mr. Chairman, Now that there are plentiful, fantastical anecdotes and stories, yes, about waste and fraud and abuse in many programs. People buying filet mignon or cartloads of Halloween candy, or as we saw in the bill on the floor of this Congress, stories of people buying liquor or going to strip clubs using SNAP benefits. But those are fantastical stories, and they're just that. They're fantasy. That's not to say that waste and fraud and abuse doesn't occur. It occurs everywhere. But the program is run by and its participants are, after all, human beings. And if you believe the Bible, like I believe the Bible, and I know many of you in here believe the Bible, you know that humans are inherently fallible. But let me conclude by saying let's look at the facts. Only 2% of recipients have later been found to be ineligible. Errors in payments, both over and under payments, are under 4%. And the rate of trafficking, which is to say selling of SNAP benefits, which is illegal, presumably now have people there. And I don't know that, I believe it's less than 1%, but does anyone here actually believe that the Department of Defense does a better job of stamping out waste and fraud and abuse? I don't think so. So, Mr. Chairman, I just say in conclusion, I appreciate you giving me this time. Then I hope the American people are watching us today, and hope they see how little this majority is interested in their health and well-being. And I hope that somewhere down the line, we all wake up and understand that you can cut so far. We got to bring in more revenue. This is an unfair position to put the poor in, faced with the defense. I yield back the balance of my time, and I thank you.
Gentlemen, time has expired. The chair understands the important nature of this debate and is willing to be flexible in his time, but the rule does say 5 minutes. The chair intends to rotate back and forth between the two sides of the room. I think the gentleman from Virginia seeks recognition next. Then just to alert members, Mr. Boswell is next in line, then Mrs. Schmidt, then Mrs. Fudge, then I believe Mr. Conaway, and then McGovern. You're going on the list. So the gentleman for Virginia is recognized for, everyone will have time. The gentleman for Virginia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for bringing forward this very well thought out and very reasonable set of selective savings from our nutrition programs that we can submit to the Congress for a vote as a part of the reconciliation package. I have to strongly disagree with the characterizations of the gentleman from Georgia. When you have a program that has grown by 270% over 10 years, and you propose to achieve 4% in savings, there is absolutely no way that working together we can't achieve 4% savings. I think we could save far, far more from this program. And when you look at the places where we're going to achieve the savings, it is absolutely without a doubt that it is wrong for a state to be able to send an individual a $1 check, 16 states in the District of Columbia do that at very little, if any, cost to them. And then that will cost the taxpayers of this country $14.3 billion over the next 10 years for a program that people, if they simply meet the otherwise eligibility requirements, if they truly are in the state of need that has been described by the gentleman and by others, they will qualify for the program anyway. But taking that fact already into account, it is clear that there are others who do not meet those criteria, and we can save $14.3 billion just by making that one change. And then a very similar change in the area of categorical eligibility, saving nearly $12 billion over 10 years by not having automatic eligibility. It's just a simple fact. People in life know that if they are eligible for something, they have to meet the criteria in order to receive it. And there should not be an automatic trigger that says they will get that eligibility simply because there's a provision in the law that says they can get it without having to show that their income and asset requirements don't meet the standards for the SNAP program. And there are 4 other savings that are in this legislation that accomplish similar goals. I think all of them are very reasonable changes to this program. I think there are many more that we could bring up here today that would save a lot more money at a time when we are running debts of $1.2, $1.3, $1.4 trillion a year. And it is very clear that the primary cause of this is the rapid growth in federal government spending. And I agree with the gentleman that there's plenty of other places where we can achieve savings, including in defense and in a whole host of other programs. We have already made cuts in a number of programs, but we have a long way to go because we are still projected to have enormous deficits. And the president's come forward with the so-called Buffett rule. The Buffett rule would, which I think has many, many flaws to it, since the 1% that he refers to only pays right now nearly 40% of personal income taxes. Obviously, I say only facetiously because when the president says they're not paying their fair share, I don't think the president is paying attention to the reality of what's going on in this country already. We're going to create even more disincentives for people to invest in the United States if we go down that taxation route. The problem is growth in spending. This program, the evidence is right there, a 270% increase over 10 years, and we can't sustain a 4% savings. I think that is absolutely missing the mark. And if we don't get the message out to everyone that we can't continue borrowing against our children and grandchildren's future to fund these programs, we are going to be like Greece in a very, very near term. These are reasonable savings in this proposal, and I strongly support them, and I commend the chairman and others for bringing them forward.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Does the gentleman from Iowa seek to be recognized to strike the last word?
I do.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and associate myself with a lot that's been said. I try not to repeat that. I'm just kind of looking at my own state, and some of the things that have just been said by those who have spoken before me. There's some reason for this, you know. I think it was in September of '08, and I don't want to go into details, just a reminder, we had a secretary come to us and said, we're going over the cliff if we don't do something. And so we've done things, and some we agree on, some we don't. But in 2010, we had in Iowa on SNAP 29,000 people. Wasn't too bad. 2011, it jumped 340. 2012 to 373. Right now in our state, we and Mr. King, we have shared the great state of Iowa, and he's busy over there, so he's not paying attention to me. It's okay. But anyway, 12.8% of our Iowans, 382,000, are food insecure. Now, Mr. Chairman, you and ranking member and others participated in what you did before the last break, and I thought you did a remarkable job. I'm proud of you. And I probably spent more time living in Oklahoma than anybody else here except you. And I could tell you a few things about Tulsa and Oklahoma City and the third largest town, Lawton, where I've spent quite a bit of time. We ought to stop and just think this out. Those of us that actually are engaged in providing food and fiber to feed people, we have an infinity of feeling for those needs. And it still happens out in the country. You know, it's different. You know, in the country, it's happened just recently, and I would guess some of you could find examples. Something goes wrong, we go help. If they're hungry, I've been known to butcher an animal because somebody needs some help. I expect you have done the same. And that can still happen. But in the urban setting, they can't do that. It's just not the opportunity. And I grew up in a time when we went to the neighbor when he broke his leg and did his work, or they were hungry. We took them food. And we can still do that. You did a good job in that first cut. Why don't we have the rest of the folks do their fair share? and then maybe come back and revisit what else we could do. Maybe you could address that for us at some point. I'll try to finish quickly here. But it seems to me like this committee and our counterparts over in the Senate stepped up to the plate and offered willingness to take reductions, cut back costs, and now here we go again. And I can't see where others have done their fair share. So with that, I want to stop and say I believe we can do better. And I think the only comfort I get is Congressman Peterson saying, well, this budget stuff don't matter anyway, because that's not what's going to happen. But it's hard on the gizzard, as we say it out in the country, and it's sure hard on our reputation. So with that, I yield back. Maybe you could comment, Mr. Chairman, what you see in your vision that when's the rest of the folks around here going to do their fair share? Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman, before he yields back, I'm sure yields me 20 seconds to respond to that. I would simply remind all my good colleagues, this is not the Farm Bill. When we engage in the Farm Bill process, we will look at all spending in all areas. There will be reductions everywhere. This is a process mandated on us by the House Budget Resolution, crafted by the Budget Committee. We're doing what we have to do today. And that's the best way to describe that. With that, I yield back my time. The gentleman's time has expired. The chair now turns to the gentlelady from Ohio, Mrs. Schmidt, I assume, seeks recognition to strike the last word.
I do, sir. Thank you very much. And
Recognized for 5 minutes.
And thank you very much for putting this before us today, because I think this is a very important debate that we have. Well, the gentleman that was first recognized tried to characterize this as a situation that we're going to decide between butter and bullets. I rather look at this as something totally different. We have the obligation to do both in our country, to provide the defense for our country so that it remains safe and strong for the folks that live here as well as for the world. And we also have the responsibility to make sure that those that actually need food assistance get the food assistance that they need. But I think you have to look at over the last 10 years of the level of participation in this SNAP program and say to yourself, why have we seen such a dramatic increase? If you look at the participation in 2002, it was 19.1 million folks. 2011, it was 44.7 million. That's an increase of 134%. The cost in 2002 to the taxpayers was $20.6 billion. Today it is $75.7 billion, an increase of 267%. And you have to say to yourself, well, where's the most dramatic rise in that going so that we can be fair to the numbers? Well, it's actually between 2009 and 2011, where we saw a 34% increase of 33.5 million to 44.7 million. And then you have to say to yourself, well, maybe that's because of unemployment. Is that part of a factor? And clearly it has been, because in 2009 it was 8.3% and it ratcheted up. But today it's at 8.3% again. So we're where we were in 2009 for unemployment. So you have to look at other underlying factors and say to yourself, is that what is making this increase larger than it should be? And I really looked at three of them and I said, maybe that's the issue. The first is the issue of getting bonuses to states. When you look at Michigan and the abuse that they accrued with the bonuses, giving college students the opportunity to have SNAP benefits, to have a lottery winner that just was recognized today in the press, is receiving $1 million at the Michigan lottery and was still getting food stamps because she wasn't working, so therefore she felt she should get it and assets didn't matter. When you look at the LHEAP and $1 eligibility puts you over automatically into the category of receiving food stamps, you have to say to yourself, maybe income and asset requirements need to be looked at when we give folks that truly need this assistance, the assistance that they need. And so what I look at here is an attempt to find out who truly needs the assistance and to have the money, the wherewithal from the taxpayers to give them the assistance that they need, and to understand that there are those that have benefited from this that may not have truly needed it from where the program was truly designed to begin with. And so while some might say, well, gee, you're really hurting the poor, I believe what we're really doing is sustaining a program to allow the poor and the truly needy to have the food that they need, and to weed off those that are getting assistance that can find other avenues, assets, income for their needs. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair notes that the gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Fudge, seeks recognition. I assume to strike the last word.
Yes, yes, sir.
Gentlelady's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the ranking member for his wisdom today and his comments. The subject of today's business meeting really does concern me greatly. The Agricultural Reconciliation Act represents this committee's singular attempt to satisfy budget cuts mandated by House Concurrent Resolution 112. This committee could have proposed cuts to any program within our jurisdiction. Yet a decision was made to have members of this committee consider cuts to only one program, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP. This committee is considering cutting more than $33 billion over 10 years from SNAP, at a time when millions of Americans are suffering, especially from long-term unemployment. They are wondering today how they will stay in their homes and feed their families. This committee is considering cutting a program that serves as a safety net for more than 46 million Americans. These people are our neighbors, they are our friends, and they live in rural, urban, and suburban America. And to my colleague from Ohio, who I consider a friend, I would say this to you, that part of the increase clearly is because food costs more today. There are more people unemployed today. There are more people hungry today. So certainly we would expect that the cost would go up. Now, I give you the bonuses. Let's take them. That's only $480 million of the $33 billion that we're talking about today. I think you're right. These cuts don't just apply to administrative cost. And they don't just apply to reducing fraud and waste in SNAP. A large portion of these cuts will indeed come from benefits. These cuts will take food out of our seniors' refrigerators and food from the mouths of babies in this country. Categorical eligibility is one of the areas affected by the proposal at issue today. This proposal asks this committee to consider preventing approximately 280,000 children, by CBO estimates, from accessing free lunch in schools. A school lunch is the only meal many of our poor children receive on a daily basis. I ask, what did children do to deserve these proposed cuts? Of all the programs that could be cut, why attempt to balance the budget on the backs of school children? Why aren't we looking at or considering cuts to direct payments for farmers today? But we'd rather pay farmers millions of dollars not to grow crops than to feed children. Something is wrong with this picture. As Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, end quote, I have the audacity to believe that people everywhere can have 3 meals a day for their bodies, education and culture for their minds, and dignity, equality, and freedom for their spirits, end quote. We talk a lot about deficits, as we should, but we also must consider what type of country we are leaving for our children. What does it say about us? What does it say about our morality and our values when we fail to care for the most defenseless among us? The poor and the hungry lack the power and the voice to fight against these proposed devastating cuts. And I certainly cannot be silent and allow for the defunding and elimination of SNAP benefits. I urge my colleagues not to engage in this type of political game at the expense of our most vulnerable constituents. I urge my colleagues not to balance the budget on the backs of those most in need. Hungry children, seniors, the disabled cannot afford these cuts, and they cannot pay our bills by themselves. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Does the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Conaway, seek recognition to strike the last word?
I do, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. We obviously do have hard choices to make. My colleague from Georgia made some references to the Department of Defense spending, and while this is not their fight today necessarily, I do need to get some facts on the record. Constitution is pretty clear that national defense is something that the federal government should provide for, and we ought to do it well, demand that. Not so sure that the Constitution says that many of the other areas that we're talking about today have that same priority for the federal government. Not to say that, and Ms. Fudge mentioned it, friends and family, they are the first line of defense for all of these issues. And when you try to interject the federal government, as big and unwieldy as it is, writing policies in D.C. where one size fits all, you get goofy answers. And so families are much more, and benevolent committees at churches and other things are much more eligible to be able to fix those properly. But the national defense. The budget that's passed, that just came out, cuts $487 billion out of future increases in defense spending. We still spend more money on defense. Quite frankly, we still spend more money on SNAP. This 4% reduction in SNAP increases is just that. It's a reduction increase. Over that time frame for the military, 80,000 soldiers and their families will have to figure out a different way to feed themselves because we're going to lay them off. 20,000 Marines are going to, same circumstance. They and their families, you got to figure out a different way to feed themselves and look for a career, because the budget in place right now, not the new cuts we're talking about here, cuts that much out of our Department of Defense. Quite frankly, I'd argue that we may not be able to defend this country the way every one of us expects today where we are with these cuts, and certainly with the $600 billion in cuts that are looming with sequestration, which these amendments attempt to address. We can't defend the country the way we want to. We have hard choices ahead. You look at the $6 trillion that the budget trims out and increased spending over the next 10 years. If we do that the way we must, there will be people who lose their jobs. There will be people who won't get money from the federal taxpayer that they otherwise thought they were going to get, and it's going to be hard. I'm a CPA and a Republican, but I got enough heart left to know how difficult it will be for those folks. I get it. But I've also got great confidence in families and communities and neighborhoods and local folks to rally to the folks that are affected by that and to move them through. We've got to grow the economy in order for this to make this thing work. And increasing taxes, as my colleague from Georgia's called for, I think goes the wrong direction. 78% of what we spend on the Farm Bill goes to the nutrition program. We're looking at 4% trim over that 10-year time frame. The draconian impacts that my colleagues on the other side have mentioned, I don't think line up with the impact that we're talking about here with the 4%. Folks who otherwise qualify for the program get the help they need. We're talking about adjusting ways in which you get into the program without qualifying for the base program. And I think these are reasonable cuts, reasonable reductions and increases in spending that are the leading edge of some really much tougher decisions that we're going to have to make in the relatively near future, if in fact the future that Ms. Fudge talks about for our grandkids and great-grandchildren is going to be remotely like the one that we stepped into as adults. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm supportive of what we're doing today. I know it's hard. I know it's going to be difficult on some, but it's a step in the right direction and is, like I said, just the leading edge of some really difficult decisions that not only the Agriculture Committee, but this entire government's going to have to make over the next relatively short period of time if, in fact, we're going to save the Republic. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. McGovern, seek recognition to strike the last word?
I do.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to begin by saying I have great respect for you, and I know that you care very deeply about the vulnerable in our societies, and I know this is a difficult position for you to be in, but I feel compelled to make it clear that I strongly oppose the measure before us today for one simple reason. It'll make hunger in America worse. There are nearly 49 million hungry Americans in this country. 17 million are children. There is not a single congressional district in America that is hunger-free, and if anybody doubts that, I'm happy to direct you to your local food pantry and introduce you to some of the people who are trying to just get by, to put some food on the table for their children. For those who don't remember, we once had people living in this country who had sunken eyes and swollen bellies because they weren't getting enough food. And thankfully, and I'm very proud to say, we have an anti-hunger safety net that prevents us from returning to those awful days. Food stamps, now called SNAP, school meals, and other programs are literally a lifeline. Yes, as my colleagues have pointed out, funding for SNAP has increased over the past decade. It increased during President Bush's 2 terms, and it has increased during President Obama's term. It increased for 2 reasons. First, because of program improvements, and second, because of need. Prior to the last Farm Bill, the average SNAP benefit was $1 per person per day. Imagine having to feed a family on that meager amount. President Bush increased programmatic funding for SNAP so people could buy healthier foods and to keep up with the rising cost of food. The Great Recession resulted in more people falling into poverty and more people needing help. I remind my colleagues that most of those receiving SNAP benefits work. They qualify for SNAP not because they want a handout, but because their wages are so low that they simply cannot afford to put food on their tables. The notion that SNAP promotes a culture of dependency, that SNAP is a golden ticket to prosperity, is just wrong. Working families are trying to earn more. No one wakes up in the morning dreaming to be on SNAP but these are tough economic times. Some people have no choice. But we know that SNAP enrollment and spending on SNAP will go down as the economy improves, as families see their incomes rise and no longer need SNAP to feed their families. Now, don't take my word for it. This is directly from the Congressional Budget Office. A common and unfortunate misconception about SNAP is that it is rife with fraud, waste, and abuse. Many have decried SNAP as a handout that can be sold or traded for alcohol or other items that shouldn't be purchased with taxpayers' funds. It cannot. SNAP is both effective and efficient. In fact, the error rate for SNAP is not only at an all-time low, it is among the lowest, if not the lowest error rate of any federal program. SNAP's payment error rate was 3.81% in 2010, which is the most recent data available. Diving deeper into this error rate, we see that only 3% of all SNAP benefits represented overpayments. Compare this, for example, to the most recent IRS data that shows that the tax noncompliance rate was 16.9% in 2006, representing a $385 billion loss. SNAP is not only an effective program, it is also an efficient one. Now, I know, as has been pointed out, that we have a budget deficit, and we have to address it. But we need to do so in a balanced and comprehensive way. But doing it by cutting SNAP, like the majority is proposing to do today, is just wrong. There are 18.5 million kids on SNAP, 22.2 million people who receive SNAP are female, and there are 3.1 million seniors on SNAP. Cutting $33 billion means that more than 22 million households will see a cut in their benefit. That means 22 million families will have less food tomorrow than they do today. In fact, 2 million people would be cut from SNAP altogether, and 280,000 kids would lose access to free school meals. Now, let me repeat that. Women, children, and the elderly will have less food on their plates if this committee passes $33 billion in cuts to SNAP. There are other programs in this committee's jurisdiction that we ought to look at first for deficit reduction, including direct payments and crop insurance. Why demonize and attack poor people? Why go after the working families who are struggling to make ends meet? Now, none of us serving on this committee is struggling to feed our families. But imagine if you had to look at your son or daughter in the eye and tell them that you can't afford to have dinner tonight or breakfast tomorrow, that there just isn't enough money to pay for the rent, gas, food, and other bills for the rest of the month, so they'll just have to go without. For families like this, and they are real, and there are tens of millions of them, SNAP is a lifeline. I say all the time that hunger is a political condition, that we have the food, we have the means to end hunger, but we don't have the political will to end it. But to have the political will to actually make hunger worse, as I think this committee is about to do, I believe is unconscionable. Now, let me just conclude by saying that I am proud that we have programs that provide a circle of protection for the poorest and the most vulnerable in our country. We should care about our neighbors. We should care about our friends. That is a good thing. That should not be considered a radical idea. And the fact that we do have these programs in this country, and yes, they can be improved, but the fact that we do is something that makes America great. And I hope that as this process moves forward, that we can fix what this committee is about to do today. We should, quite frankly, and I'll just close with this. So, we should be having a hearing today on hunger in America and not on how we're going to cut $33 billion out of SNAP. People ought to realize that there is a cost to hunger in America. Avoidable health care costs, lost productivity, children who don't learn in school. You know, if we want to save money, we ought to deal with this hunger problem in a straightforward way. And in conclusion, Mr. Chairman, I would like to ask unanimous consent to insert in the record a letter from the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops which oppose what we're doing today in this hearing. I thank the chairman for his time.
Seeing no objection, so ordered. Added to the record. Gentleman yields back his time. For the benefit of the membership, I would note that I have Mr. King, Pingree, Welch, and Sewell in the query. The gentleman from Iowa, Mr. King, do you seek recognition to strike the last word?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I recall the day that I swore into office as a state senator in Iowa on January 13th, 1997. And when I stepped back from the well, having placed my hand on the Bible and taken my oath, they told me, now, welcome to the Iowa Senate. You will be accused of freezing seniors and starving children. I listened to some of the remarks here today, and it says this will take food from our seniors' refrigerators and food from the mouths of babies. Those words echo from down at the well of the Iowa Senate, where Mr. Boswell and I have both served, and to this point today. There's much of this is a political discussion. Some of it is a substantive discussion that talks about people that are hungry. And I look at the First Lady, who has initiated a movement for healthier eating, and it's designed to help the obesity in young people that we have as a problem in this country. I remember the previous Secretary of Defense, and we've talked about our national defense, and the measure that said that 30% of our young people are obese, and it's a national security issue because we can't recruit enough young people to fill our military. I say just extend basic training a while and anybody can get in shape. We haven't lost them because they happen to be obese at age 18. But I was sitting in this very room on March 13th, 2007, when the testimony on the markup of that farm bill was unfolding, and we were dealing with the nutrition components of the farm bill. And the witness before us was Janet Murguia, and she is, or was at least, the president of La Raza. And she was talking about the obesity problem we have in America, and she said this, and I quote, "There is also mounting evidence that the overweight and obesity trends in the United States are due in part to high levels of food insecurity." Now, common sense-minded people that arrived at this Congress since that period of time would have their heads spinning trying to figure out what that argument really meant. And what it meant was that if people are overweight and we give them more food, that will solve the overweight problem because they'll tend to eat less. That was what that testimony was. I haven't heard that argument here today, but I think it's important to make that point. And consistent with the First Lady's initiative, it's about, according to a discussion with some food retailers, it's about removing 1.5 trillion calories from the diets of mostly young people in an effort to try to solve some of the obesity problem in America. And it's curious to me that the effort of the First Lady to do so, and I'm not tacking that number of calories to her, but the theme I am associating with her effort, it's curious that there's not pushback from Democrats on that effort, but there is pushback from Democrats on this effort to do something that simply lowers the safety net. We have in this country a number of somewhere between 86 million and 100 million Americans who are of working age that are simply not in the workforce. It's a tremendous waste of human resources, human skill, human effort, human talent. And yet we have, according to Robert Rector, the Heritage Foundation, 72 different means-tested federal welfare programs. This is one. And this effort that we have here today is not to remove a safety net. This is to ratchet the hammock down just one click. And perhaps some of the people that will be part of those that are the focus of this legislation will then take a look and figure out how they can contribute, grab a hold of their oar, trim the sails, swab the decks, work in the galley, whatever it needs to do to help improve and increase the gross domestic product of the United States. When you give people 72 different programs, there's not a single American that can even list those programs from memory let alone tell you how they all interrelate with each other, let alone explain how it affects the behavior of our society as from individual standpoint, let alone as a member of a group. And so I think what's going on here is, as Mr. Conway said, it is a prudent step in the right direction. We have to get this spending under control, and I think this is also a good position for the Ag Committee to take, and I don't think that people are going to starve because of this action. And what will happen in the end will be the loans will be foreclosed upon in the United States of America someday if we continue to spend 42 cents out of every dollar that we spend. So, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for bringing this prudent proposal before this committee, and I certainly support it and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Maine seek recognition?
I ask to strike the last word, Mr. Chair.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the time, and I certainly understand the difficult position that you're in today, but like many of my colleagues, want to address this topic and want to ask unanimous consent to insert into the record the full text of my remarks. I will be a little bit more brief than I could be.
Seeing no objection, the full remarks are happily accepted.
Thank you, and also a letter from several organizations in our state about the impact that this will have on the state of Maine. This committee has the opportunity to look at farm programs in our purview and give thoughtful consideration to where programs could be trimmed, spreading the pain of reconciliation cuts fairly among our programs, as so many of us have already mentioned today. But unfortunately, the majority has instead decided that 100% of all reconciliation cuts should come entirely from the SNAP program, an enormous $33 billion cut, which will come from the most vulnerable in our society. Nearly 75% of SNAP participants, as so many have said, are in families with children, and more than 25% of the participants are in households with seniors or people with disabilities. These families are struggling to put food on the table, and their lives will be that much more difficult if their SNAP benefits are reduced. This cut is clearly just a down payment on the disgraceful $134 billion SNAP cut that was outlined in the Ryan budget, a 17% cut to the program, which passed the House easily 2 weeks ago. Rather than increasing taxes on the wealthiest Americans, or touching the overblown defense budget, or raising revenue from corporations by closing tax loopholes, we are being asked to vote today to cut $33 billion from one of our most efficient, effective, and helpful safety net programs. The 100% of the reconciliation cuts will come out of the SNAP program would be wrong at any time. But proposing such an outrageous cut when unemployment has been above 8% and food insecurity remains prevalent makes this cut much more painful for those who have been hurt the hardest by the economic downturn and its aftermath. As we have heard before, this cut of $36 billion means less food will be available for nourishing poor children so they can reach their full potential, and less food available to help the disabled, the elderly. It would also mean, as we have heard, that thousands of poor children would lose access to free school meals. Since poor children who receive SNAP are automatically enrolled to receive free school meals, children who lose SNAP benefits would have to start paying the reduced price for the healthy, nourishing food that they need in the middle of the day, and many families would not be able to afford this cost. There are a number of programs we could be considering in this markup. Just last week, the GAO released a report showing that federal government could save $1 billion a year by reducing the subsidies it pays to large farms for crop insurance. Isn't this an area that the committee should have considered in our cuts for reconciliation? Of course it is. The committee is due to consider a farm bill this year, and as many members have mentioned, for decades, farm bills have been undertaken in a carefully negotiated bipartisan process. But if this is how we're starting the process right off the bat with this huge cut to SNAP, leaving every other program untouched, how are we supposed to move forward on any kind of negotiations on the farm bill this year? I urge my colleagues on the committee to reject this proposal and get back to the work of a serious farm bill. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Continuing our back and forth, I believe the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Stutzman, seeks recognition. And for what purpose does he seek recognition?
Strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and appreciate you being willing to recognize the members for this discussion. I think this isn't, this may seem difficult, but you know, it's always easier to spend money than it is to start reining in the spending in anybody's budget. I always, I just took our boys to the store this last week to buy baseball shoes for Little League, and they found plenty of things that they would have wanted to spend money on, and it would have been easy to do so because I was trying to make my boys happy. But at the time, I had to tell them that we had to stick to priorities and that we had to stick to the amount of money that we had in the bank. And we couldn't overspend. And so this is the same basic principle that we have here today. We have, the fact is that we have overspent over the past decade within the federal government. And you look at the growth that SNAP has had, this is just one aspect, just one part of the overspending in Washington that we're now having to face and having to deal with. And it is not easy, but at the same time, it has to happen, and it has to be a priority of ours to start shrinking the deficit so that we can start paying down the debt that faces our children and our grandchildren. Almost $16 trillion of debt is immoral to hand off to our kids and to our grandkids when our economy is still sensitive. It is still trying to find confidence. This is an important part of us in showing leadership to the rest of the country that we are going to get our fiscal house in order. Had the opportunity this last week to visit farms and businesses back home, and they kept us saying, you know what, we have tightened our belt. We have found the waste in our particular businesses. We have found ways to do things better. It's not always just waste. It's finding new processes, new systems to make us more efficient. And they said we had one of we had one of the best quarters that we've had in a long, long time. The only fear that we have right now is the federal government, and that you guys have not gotten your house in order. And when is that going to happen? And so there's a lot of uncertainty out there because, frankly, the federal government and Congress refuses to take action in addressing the fiscal challenges, the fiscal spending problems that we have. And this is one of the particular programs. As Mr. King mentioned in budget yesterday, we talked about the 72 programs that the federal government has. And I can tell you that I have constituents in my district that are getting very frustrated with those who are their neighbors who are abusing programs when they know that they don't need them. And that is something that I think we need to deal with. I know every one of us on this committee have folks in our district that genuinely, sincerely do need help. And whether they're going to the government to find that help, whether they're going to a church or a charity, there is plenty of Americans are very willing to help those who really are in need. I think that there are several important facts that we need to face here and to realize that between 2003 and 2007, unemployment fell 1.4%, and between that same time period, SNAP caseloads increased 22%. So there seems to be a real disconnect between the expansion of this program and helping people find employment and self-sustainability. This program has continued to grow. I think it is important that we realize that this growth is something that is I believe, artificial because it is something that there's citizens that are taking advantage of the program, but also because of the fiscal policies of Washington, we have put people in a vulnerable position because they don't have jobs. We should be focusing on jobs in the economy, and this is part of the consequence to the spending that has gone on here in Washington. I'd also like to make this point too, that it was mentioned before that we are paying farmers not to grow crops. We don't have that particular program anymore. We still have CRP, and we are paying landowners to let land set aside, and I'd be glad to talk about that particular program as well. We could trim back there, but that is we are not paying farmers to not grow crops anymore. And farmers are telling me in my district that they would do without the direct payments, and that they'd like to see agriculture or see government get out of agriculture's business and let them be successful without government subsidies. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Vermont seeks recognition.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
The gentleman moves to strike the last word.
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Congress is failing the American people, and the Budget Committee is failing this committee. We do have a debt, but is it at all realistic that we're going to make progress in solving the debt without putting every single thing on the table? Now, that does mean spending programs, including taking a hard look at SNAP. Are there administrative efficiencies that we can come up with? Is the program being used? Those are all fair and legitimate questions. But how is it that we're going to get to success in dealing with the debt when we take the Pentagon off the table and exempt it from making any contribution? How is it that we're going to get to success if we take revenues off the table? A major problem that this country has is the decline of the middle class. We have economic policies that are putting the squeeze on low-income folks who are trying to fight their way into the middle class, and in the families in the middle class trying to stay there. Most families have two people working. They make $45,000 a year between them. They struggle. Yet the policies that we pursue put the greatest burden on them. Now, what's happened here? The Budget Committee failed, the super committee failed to come up with a $1.2 trillion in cuts. And now there was supposed to be a sequester that went into effect where half would come from discretionary programs. That would impact this one. But half was supposed to come from Pentagon savings. What has happened? The Budget Committee is proposing that the Pentagon cuts be exempt from that sequester, bear no responsibility to contribute to addressing this debt situation, and the full burden has come down on the discretionary programs. This includes the SNAP programs. Poverty in this country has increased dramatically. That's not because people want to choose poverty. They want opportunity. Now we're cutting the programs that are a lifeline to many families and many kids, and it's not a necessary decision. There are other options. Revenues are an option. The Pentagon contributing to reducing the debt is an option. If we take those two options off the table, the only thing we can do is make draconian cuts in other areas. Now, my friends may disagree, but I believe that the concentration of wealth at the top end, the highest we've seen since just before the Great Depression, is a problem. You know, in 1976, the top 1% in the country had 8.9% of the wealth of the country. In 2007, the top 1% had 23.5% of the wealth. Now, sometimes when I say that, people think that this is class warfare and that it's wealth envy. It is not that. The question for this country economically is, do we want to build a strong middle class? Seriously. You know, the best democracy is when there is opportunity for everyone. And policies make a difference. The tax policies that we pass, the Social Security safety net that we have, the economic policies that we have, those have an impact on what opportunity is. And the policies that this country has had, one way or the other, has resulted in a significant accumulation of an enormous amount of wealth at the very high end. That stifles a strong economy. If we have people who are struggling to make ends meet, and they can't afford to pay to send their kids to college, they barely can afford to pay their bills. Kids getting out of college have debts on average of $30,000. And in 73 days, none of us want this to happen, but in 73 days, student loans are going to go from 3.4% to 6.8%. So you're going to have kids going into the workforce with this albatross of financial debt, yet we don't have the imagination or the ability to come up with a way to give them a little help. That has obviously impacts on them, but it has a real impact on the economy because they're not going to be able to buy the things and be the consumers that in the buying of those things, they're going to help create jobs and create profits for companies that we need. So the question, I think, for us in Congress is, are we doing the job we need to rebuild the middle class, to embrace what has always been an approach that Congress has had in this country, to see middle class opportunity as something, and income, and more income equality is something that actually is about opportunity. It's about creating a stronger, more resilient, more sustainable economy. The design that we have from the Budget Committee makes that all but impossible. We have this discussion where, yes, anyone who says we've got an unsustainable debt is saying something that is true. I agree with that. But my view, the only way we're going to get there in a way that's fair is all of us have to have some skin in the game. And yes, that does mean folks who are getting SNAP benefits, but it also means people who are doing really well and can pay a bit more. It also means the Pentagon, where with real careful consideration, we can make some savings without jeopardizing our national security. And what I think all of us know in our heart is that the only way we're going to get there is if somehow we bridge this dysfunction of our inability to find some common ground and keep treating compromise as though it's a four-letter word. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time, and before the chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, he turns to the gentleman from Pennsylvania for a unanimous consent request.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent to submit my statement for the record.
Seeing no objection, so ordered. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Austin Scott, to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, sir.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Move to strike the last word. And as I've listened to the arguments against this and about the lack of a middle class in America, I can't help but think that, the bottom line is the bigger the federal government budget gets, the less opportunity there is for lower income and middle income Americans to grow their household budgets. And the problem that we're having with the middle class in America is, quite honestly, the federal government and federal spending has gotten too big. And I think of the song, it's Crosby, Stills, and Nash, I guess, that had coined the words, tax the rich to feed the poor until there are no rich no more. And that seems to be the attitude of the current administration. Now let's talk about this term fair share that keeps coming up. Let's talk about what a millionaire is. In my area of the country, in central Georgia, good irrigated cropland is going to go for about $3,500 an acre. So if you're a farmer with 285 acres of farmland, you're a millionaire. And according to the president, you're not paying your fair share because you're a millionaire. If you farm 285 acres. Now in other areas of the country, farmland goes for $15,000 an acre. That's 66 acres. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you simply can't feed the hungry by seizing the assets of the farmer. And what this president and what other liberals have proposed to do is to seize as much as 55% of the assets of farmers that are worth over $1 million. It simply won't work. You want more hungry people in America? You want more hungry people in America? Then you follow the president's proposal on the federal estate tax and you seize the assets of the farmers, and I promise you, you'll have more hungry people in America. What we've asked for here is reasonable reductions in increases in the growth of spending in the food stamp program. 96% of the total spending is on the program is still going to be there. It's going to far exceed what the spending was on the legislation in the programs just a few short years ago. Every American I know has been in line behind the person that's pulled out the food stamp card with their buggy full of groceries. And they put it up there, and they put it up there with their beer and their cigarettes and everything else, and they pull out that food stamp card, and whatever's covered under food stamps, they pay for it with the food stamp card, and then whatever's not covered under food stamps, they open up their wallet, and they pay for it with cash. Americans, working Americans, those working Americans, the middle income and low income working Americans that are out there doing the best they can and struggling are sick and tired of watching the abuses in the system. All we're talking about doing here is putting an end to the abuses in the system. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the remainder of my time, but I just want to say this one more time. You can't feed the hungry, starving the farmer.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. I believe the chair has a request for recognition from the gentle lady from Alabama, Ms. Sewell. Does she seek to strike the last word?
I do, sir.
The lady's recognized for 5 minutes.
First, I'd like to thank Chairman Lucas and Ranking Member Peterson for your leadership on this committee. This morning, I stand in support of struggling families and low-income women and children across the 7th Congressional District of Alabama and this entire nation. The budget reconciliation proposal being considered today would result in a harsh cut to vital services, vital programs, investments provided by SNAP program. While I understand that our nation faces a serious budget deficit, we also face a jobs deficit, a fragile economy recovery, and families who desperately need and must depend upon assistance programs such as SNAP that allow them to put food on the table and meet everyday needs. There is no dispute that times are hard and that we must make difficult budgetary decisions. However, we cannot afford to address our nation's deficit reduction problem at the expense of these most vulnerable in our society. I am deeply concerned that the types of cuts in the Republicans' budget reconciliation proposal are ill-advised and disproportionate. SNAP is a cornerstone of this nation's nutrition assistance safety net. It touches the lives of over 1 in 7 Americans and is an essential program for low-income individuals who cannot afford to purchase food for themselves and their families. In January 2012, approximately 46.5 million Americans were receiving SNAP benefits. And in 2010, SNAP provided about $1.2 billion in food benefits to over 800,000 Alabamians monthly. Since the program was created, SNAP has literally saved millions of lives and currently provides essential support to over 165,000 individuals in my district in Alabama alone. A recent USDA study estimates that SNAP benefits reduce the severity of U.S. poverty by an average of 13.2% between the years 2000 and 2009. The study also showed that child poverty was reduced by 21.3% as a result of the SNAP benefits. The lack of proper funding in this Republican budget reconciliation proposal appears to be nothing more than a misguided attack on hardworking families and poor women and low-income and poor children that desperately need this type of nutrition and government assistance. And I cannot stand idly by and let this occur without speaking up. It is our responsibility to ensure that any budget proposal provides robust and adequate funding for essential benefits both now and in the future. As members of Congress, we must remember that the decisions we make here today regarding future spending and levels for SNAP and other programs will have a real impact on people back home in our districts, our neighbors, our constituents, our families, all of whom are struggling in this difficult economy, struggling to put food on the table, struggling to keep the jobs that they have, struggling to find jobs when they don't have them. These low-income and struggling families have already given more than their fair share to help ease our nation's economic troubles. However, here we are today again asking that these struggling Americans give more and more by proposing cuts to these essential and life-saving measures. You know, we have to make difficult choices. We live in difficult economic times. It seems to me that this debate about deficit reduction is really fundamentally a debate about our priorities as a nation. Where I come from, we help our neighbors. Where I come from, we help those who need money, who need food. Where I come from, we see our own individual plight as a plight for our own communities. And it is because of that that I am devastated by the suggestion that we have to make further and further cuts on food programs. I don't think this is an either or proposition. We clearly have to make sure that our defense is robust, that we make sure our national security is adequate, actually more than adequate. It's not an either or proposition. In my opinion, it's an and proposition. We need to provide for our national defense and take care of the least and most vulnerable among us. Today, I ask my colleagues to seriously consider voting against this proposal. Thanks.
Time of the gentlelady has expired. It's only fitting that the final recognition request come from a gentleman who very much understands these issues. Does the gentleman from California, Mr. Baca, seek to strike the last word?
I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Lucas and Ranking Member Peterson, not for bringing up the reconciliation, but thank you, for having this hearing. I prefer that we didn't have this. I wish to express my strong opposition to this misguided reconciliation proposal the committee is reviewing today. I've heard from some of the comments from the other individuals in that side of the room. Everyone in this room knows that process is a sham. It is a sham. Let's face it, it is a sham. Chairman Ryan's budget will never be approved by the Senate, and the policies recommended today will never move forward. So we have to face, what is it that we can actually move forward? What are the areas that we can work on? All I can say is, thank God that these cuts to SNAP programs will never be enacted, and I hope that they never will be. Today's proposal recommends over $33.2 billion in cuts to SNAP over the next 10 years. This policy is the wrong thing to do and will significantly harm the well-being of American working families and children. And we've got to remember working families and children. It's not, a lot of us agree with some of the comments about the abuse. There is abuse that is done, but that's where the oversight needs to be done, the accountability needs to be done, but you don't punish those that need help, and I think that's very important. In these tough economic times, it's our job to lend a lending hand to the poor and the disadvantaged among us. We help other countries, and we're willing to spend all kinds of money on other countries, and we haven't cut our deficit to a lot of these other countries. But here in the United States, people who are going hungry, we need to make sure that we take care of them, make sure that they have the ability to put food on the table. The 2008 Farm Bill, we worked together on a bipartisan, and we were able to provide a record funding for nutrition. As the economy struggles, we have seen now over 44.7 million Americans relying on the SNAP program to put food on the table for their families. I want to say, put food on the table. You have to put yourself in that situation. Have any of you ever been in a situation where you needed help, where you needed the SNAP program? Well, I did. I was in that situation where I needed help. I was struggling. I couldn't make it. My wife couldn't make it. We had to feed my child during that period of time. It wasn't abuse. It was that I needed to put food on the table and take care of my family. And you know how difficult it is? You don't want to ask for help, but you know that you needed help. And I needed help. And thank God that we had food stamps. We changed the connotation now from food stamps to SNAP, but we worked on it on a bipartisan. But we remembered the people who are struggling, the children who are struggling, the individuals right now. And when we look at America right now, and we look at our area, we have more people that are unemployed than they've been in some time for another. There are many individuals that can't afford to put food on the table. There are many of our children that are suffering right now. And thank God for the last Farm Bill that we had. We increased it to all 50 states, where a lot of our schools now have a lunch program to feed many of these kids that are going to school on an empty stomach. And can you imagine going on an empty stomach and not having the food to provide, and having to take the test, and having to compete with someone else? You have to put yourself in that situation unless you've been there. Well, it's easy to sit here and say, well, you know what, we've got to make some difficult decisions. We've got to lower the deficit. You know what, my kids, in terms of Little League, but you know what? You can take your kids to a Little League game. You can decide what you want, what you don't. Some people don't have that choice. They have no choices. They'd love to have that choice. They'd love to have the finances to say, I can't afford or I can't. They don't have a choice, just like I didn't have a choice. And when you've been in that situation, you begin to understand it a little bit better. You begin to say, you know what, we've got to make sure that we do something. That's why the proposal that we have before us eliminates the Recovery Act, the SNAP, increase by causing benefits to drop by over 13%, eliminates the category eligibility, which would prevent 280,000 children from receiving the free school meals that I talked about. And these are kids. These are kids that we want to perform. These are the kids that are going to be the leaders of tomorrow. We've got to make sure they become the leaders of tomorrow. Make sure that they can compete equally as anybody else. But we've got to provide it. What does that do? It helps our farmers too as well that are providing what needs to be done. And you know what it also does? It provides jobs. It provides jobs in our areas. Because that means people are hired. When you have the nutritional program and they're going to a store, you have clerks, and the revenue that goes right back into the area. It's just not about cutting, food stamps or SNAP. It's about that revenue that also comes back into our areas. People who have an opportunity. And we've got to look at the brighter picture. Yes, we've got to look at our deficit, but it's got to be done sound and with balanced approach. I believe that what we're doing right now is not the right thing.
And in my district, there's over 180,000 households who receive SNAP benefits. We're the fourth highest nation in foreclosure. We're number one in poverty in the area. You tell my constituents, or you tell myself that was been in that situation, how am I going to feed my family when I don't have a job? How am I going to feed them? And when we're seeing other countries being fed, and we're not feeding our own people right here in the United States, where are our priorities? Where are our priorities? They should be for the people right here. We should take care of those that need help. Yes, we can deal with a deficit. We can deal with a deficit. But it has to be done in the right form, in the right way. That's why it's wrong to leave the struggling families out in the cold. Let's not forget, SNAP is good for our economy. Every $5 of the new SNAP benefits generates $9 in total economy. We must not turn our backs in the clock on what progress that we have made. I think, and I urge my colleagues to vote no on the Agriculture Reconciliation Act. I know that my time has passed, but I'm very compassionate because I've felt it. I've been there. I know what it's like. And you've got to put yourself in that situation. And when you put yourself in that situation, then make those kind of decisions, because it's easy to sit here and cut everybody else, but you're not in that damn situation. Excuse my language, but you're not in that situation. And when you're in that situation, it makes a big difference. And the last thing that I want to say is that from a religious perspective, is the Lord has always told us to watch others and help others. Love thy neighbor. Take care of that neighbor. And if we truly believe in caring about others, then we're going to do the right thing, because God and the Lord and the churches have asked us to do.
Will the gentleman yield?
Thank you.
The gentleman yield.
Yes.
Mr. Sutherland from Florida.
Sutherland.
You know what,
Gentleman's recognized. The gentleman.
My time has expired, but.
The gentleman's time has expired.
But I'm willing to yield.
By unanimous consent, the gentleman wishes to have one additional minute to yield to the gentleman from Florida. Seeing no objection.
My good friend and a good golfer, too, as well.
1 minute.
I want to say, I hear oftentimes reference to Scripture in the Bible. And from the other side of the aisle, I cut my teeth on a church pew. All right, I grew up in a Christian home. All right, my father never dropped us off at church. He parked the car, and we went in. I'm proud to be a born-again Christian. I'm proud to the fact,
God bless
that He is the Lord of my life. But I know this, sir. Nowhere in Scripture did God give the instruction to government over us as the individual. I'm just telling you.
But He always took care of people
as
as well. He took care of all of the people as well.
Sir.
He took care of all of the people as well. He made sure the government was hungry. When He took the bread and divided the bread and gave bread to everyone who was going hungry, He had the fish for everyone.
Regular order.
I reclaim my time.
Gentleman has 7 seconds.
Very good. Read it, sir. Don't take it out of context. He was speaking to individuals, not governments.
Gentleman's time has expired. Being no additional request for recognition, I turn to the gentleman for Virginia for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee favorably report the Agricultural Reconciliation Act of 2012 to the Committee on the Budget for insertion in the reconciliation bill.
Seeing no additional debate request, the question is on the motion to favorably report the Agricultural Reconciliation Act of 2012 to the Committee on Budget. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed signify by saying no.
No.
The ayes appear to have it. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do indeed have it. The ayes and the motion will be forwarded to the Committee on Budget. Does any member give notice of intent to file supplemental, minority, or additional views to the measure considered today?
Mr. Chairman, we do have minority views we'd like included in the...
So ordered. Without objection, the usual instructions will be given to staff, consistent of making such technical, clarifying, and affirming changes as are appropriate without changing the substance of the legislation. The meeting is now adjourned.